The Book of the Full Moon, Coffin Text Decoded, the oldest religious text in the world. This audio presentation is read and voiced by Shakim Ra. It is provided to the public by Amun-Ra University. Coffin texts 154 through 160 were written in ancient Kemet at the beginning of the second millennium BCE. However, their scientific value and tradition revive earlier themes seen in the pyramid text, as well as undated inscriptions. Certainly, Coffin texts 154 through 160 have long been known to form one composition because in their titles, all of them say and are connected with the knowledge of the bonds, that is, the powers or essential qualities that make a thing distinctively what it is. These spells are also frequently cited in discussions about the lunar concepts of the ancient Egyptians. Yet so far, these two quite noticeable aspects of the spells have not been intertwined more tightly. The major claim of this presentation is that the purpose of these spells is to describe the moon and its relationship to phage production. A careful reading of the text will reveal a connection between the Earth's cell and the cosmological domain, and thus, the afterlife cloning experiment of the ancient Egyptian nobility becomes clearer in light of their lunar associations with biological expression. After the introduction, Coffin text 154, which explains the origins of the month, the separate texts represent the successive stages of the monthly cycle. The period of invisibility, 155. The waxing, spell 156. Events around the full moon, spell 157. Waning of the moon, spell 158. The arrival of the last crescent at the eastern horizon, spell 159. And again, the conjunction of the sun and the moon, when a solar eclipse can occur, spell 160. The Book of the Moon gives a systematic description of the lunar events as they unfold along the month, and thus being the oldest written composition about the Earth satellite anywhere in the world. The Book of the Moon was in all probability spurred by what we would now call scientific interest. It must be noted, nevertheless, that it belongs to the rare class of ancient Egyptian literary works that treats all aspects of a particular topic in depth. What prompted the writing of the Book of the Moon is obvious from the circumstances where we encounter it. As stated previously, it is part of a larger collection of tradition, the pyramid text, which later became the basis and formulas used in the Coffin text that represent the second great wave of literary production in terms of Egyptian funerary literature. Whereas the oldest corpus of religious spells or spiritual texts, the pyramid texts, were initially, as their name suggests, carved on the walls of Old Kingdom pyramids, the Coffin text augmented and superseded their antecedents at the end of the Old Kingdom, and especially during the Middle Kingdom. They were, and here the appellation is also quite revealing, primarily written in ink on the different surfaces of coffins that were made for the members of the elite at various places throughout Kemet, most notably among them Asyut, Beni Hassan, Deir el-Bershah, El-Ishit. Whether there was a clear divide between the pyramid and coffin texts, as earlier research opined, or they represented an essential continuity, as is now often emphasized. The two, corpora, were surely created to enhance the chances of the deceased for resurrection by enabling them to overcome the difficulties that unfolded in connection with the transition from one life to the next. This is the context in which the Book of the Moon was born. Numerous concepts existed side by side about rebirth, in accordance with the ancient Egyptian mindset that saw no irreconcilable differences between that would for us seem to be mutually exclusive. Even if we only consider the astral aspects of resurrection, the analysis of funerary texts and monuments shows us that three intertwined strands of tradition were perpetuated. Although the emphasis put on them may change with time, it is clear that all three of them permeate Egyptian thought throughout the different stages of mortuary literature. One is connected with the stars and claims that eternal life is possible as a star in the sky, especially in the company of the imperishable ones, Jehemiel Seket. Jehemul Set, literally, those who do not know destruction, or the indestructible ones or great ones mentioned in the pyramid text of Teti, Pepi I, and Unas. That is, the circumpolar stars that are always seen in the night sky and never set below the horizon. According to another set of beliefs, resurrection could be affected by repeating the life cycle of the sun. Each night, the sun enters the netherworld and thus dies, but at dawn, it triumphantly re-emerges from the eastern horizon to illuminate the world of the living. It is, in fact, and in essence, reborn every day. Finally, rebirth is to be achieved by acquiring the ability of the moon to renew its cycle, by copying its successful transition from waning and total invisibility, death, to waxing and flourishing. The moon in funerary literature. At this point, to put the Book of the Moon into perspective, we may take a brief overview of how the moon appears throughout time in Egyptian funerary literature. A short summary of this kind may help to highlight the delicate changes by which the role of the moon shifted and its importance grew. We have to bear in mind, however, that the passages in the large corpora of funerary literature have something to say about the moon and can be classified into two groups. One, comprising the text, whose lunar content is obvious, while the other, encompassing those descriptions that modern researchers suspect to have lunar connotations. Obviously, into the first group belong such texts that expressly mention the moon or lunar feast days, while the second group can deal with a wide range of subjects. Although the earliest collection of mortuary spells, the pyramid texts, are usually associated with the ideas of stellar and solar rebirth, it does not mean that references to the moon are entirely absent. It is true, however, that these mostly do not go beyond simply mentioning lunar feasts or just naming the moon in a context that otherwise is not predominantly lunar. The Egyptian name for the moon was Jet, and we encounter this designation 3 times within the pyramid text. The king is said to be born in his months as the moon, or the moon is his brother, as he is ferrying over to the imperishable stars. While at the 3rd place, the moon is identified as the king's father. In every case, the moon is associated with the morning star, or more literally, the morning god. Nature Dui Ije, a celestial entity whose exact identity is debated, but nevertheless belongs to the eastern side of the sky. So the moon in these passages seems to be strongly linked to the idea of astral rebirth in the east. Another group of spells with a clear-cut lunar content are the texts that mention different feast days of the lunar month. It must be pointed out, however, that only 16 spells in the pyramid text include references to such feasts, making up about 2% of the total number of utterances. So lunar feasts by no means play a crucial role in early mortuary literature. The 5 monthly feast days mentioned in the pyramid text, blacked out moon, crescent day, the 6th day, the 7th day, and the 15th day, the half month, occur mostly in connection with offerings made to the deceased and purification rituals. 2 interesting spells link the beginning and middle of the lunar cycle, the crescent day and the day of the full moon, the 15th day with the idea of baldness and its remedy in the form of hair spittle. These descriptions, no doubt, testify to an ancient concept that understood the monthly waxing of the moon as a head gradually becoming bald after being fully covered by hair. During invisibility, when the moon is totally dark. Though again, they are only scarcely referred to. Khonsu is mentioned only once in the framework of the so-called cannibal hymn. Thoth, the lunar god par excellence of the ancient Egyptians, gets more numerous mentions in the pyramid texts. In connection with lunar phenomena, Thoth or Tahuti can either be the moon itself, or he can act as a protector or assistant of the moon. Since, however, he can fulfill various roles in different mythological cycles, he does not always appear in the spells in connection with his lunar connotations, or at least these connotations are not straightforward. Nevertheless, there are some particular passages in which he seems to feature almost certainly because of his close associations with the moon. A very good example for this is utterance 210, that speaks about 2 companions who cross the sky and who are Ra and Tahuti, and in which the speaker identifies himself with the statements, "I go round the sky like Ra, I traverse the sky like Tahuti." From the parallels with the sun god Ra, it seems highly likely that in these passages Thoth represents the moon. Thoth is sometimes involved in helping the deceased to get from one side of the sky to the other, as for example in utterance 270, in which the celestial ferryman is linked with 2 divine entities, Thoth and he who looks backwards. and he who looks backwards, who is in all probability the designation of the waning moon. This latter being also has a counterpart named he who looks forward, and together these two figures seem to refer to the opposite facets of the moon during waxing and waning. Thus, it may be said that in the pyramid text, the moon most characteristically appears as a celestial ferryman that facilitates the deceased voyage in and between the different regions of the netherworld. It is usually assumed that this ferryman transports the deceased across the winding waterway, the band of the sky where the sun, moon, and the planets move. From the south to the north, that is to the region of the circumpolar stars, a prime area for netherworldly existence. Having said that, it is equally possible that the moon, as a celestial ferryman, likewise also assists the dead soul to depart from the west and reach the eastern part of the sky, the place of sunrise, and thus that of rebirth, as during its monthly cycle, the moon gets from the west, first crescent after the sunset, to the east, the last crescent before sunrise. Another spell of the pyramid text, utterance 359, that talks about the lunar ferryman also contains references to the Eye of Horus, which was, of course, as can be deduced primarily from later sources, a very important symbol of the moon. There are numerous references to the Eye of Horus in the pyramid text, but as it was the general designation for offerings and also has solar connotations, it is again not always clear whether a particular reference to it should be interpreted in lunar terms or not. Since the general tone of utterance 359, with its allusions to the fight between Horus and Seth, their injuries, Thoth, and the ferryman called he who looks backwards, seems to be lunar, it is quite probable that this spell is one of several passages in the pyramid text in which the Eye of Horus is the equivalent of the moon. In the Coffin text, references to the moon are not only more numerous, but they also become longer and more sophisticated. This is precisely one of the reasons why we can identify one distinct set of these texts, the subject matter of the present volume, spells 154 through 160, as a composition that gives an extended account of the lunar cycle. There are, however, further spells that, based either on their title or content, concern themselves with the major theme of lunar phenomena. In this category fall, among others, spell 6, which in all probability talks about the appearance of the first crescent, the feather in the sky on the western horizon, following the blacked out moon. Spell 207, in which two goddesses are invoked with the hope of being reborn as the moon. Spell 246, in which the speaker assumes the identity of the invisible moon. And spells 824 and 1096 that associate the moon with Tahuti and the Eye of Horus. Indeed, it is in the Coffin text that the Eye of Horus first appears as the indisputed symbol of the moon, as for example, spell 1096 specifies, "This is Thoth, who is in the sky. The Eye of Horus is on his hands in the mansion of the moon." Lunar feast days continue to be mentioned in the Coffin text, include references to 7 of them: the blacked out moon, the crescent day or the first day, the 4th day, the 6th day, the 7th day, the 8th day, and half-month day. Some of the spells that talk about these feasts are leftovers from the pyramid text, but new spells are also created so that the number and proportion of the spells mentioning lunar feasts slightly increase, 16 in the pyramid text as opposed to 40 in the Coffin text. In addition to offerings and purification, which were the primary context of these spells in the earlier corpus, a new robe emerges for the lunar feast days in the instructions that give information on the performance of the text. Lunar days are also associated with themes that are connected with protection, transformations, and the adverse conditions of the netherworld. Not eating excrement and not walking upside down. These conditions, though they were also described in other contexts in the pyramid text, had not been elaborated in connection with the lunar feast days earlier. Just as in the pyramid text, the moon is expressly mentioned in several spells of the Coffin text. In 2 very similar spells, 93 and 152, the speaker addresses an entity that is called the Soul One and is identified as someone who shines or rises in the moon. Since the purpose of these spells, as their title suggests, is to go forth by the day and live after death, they seem to testify to a belief that resurrection in the next life was comparable with the behavior of the moon. Though the dead are not yet directly identified with the moon itself, spell 176 also refers to some divinities who are in the great moon and probably alludes to the situation when the moon is in conjunction with the sun, because the stated purpose of the spell is to go forth to the place in the sky where Ra is. A very similar statement is made in spell 853. In an obscure passage, the mansion of the moon is identified as the place where thought makes judgment. Spell 467 describes the topography of the field of rest, or alternately, the field of offerings, an area in the netherworld where the deceased spend their days, and the moon here appears in connection with verdant vegetation. In a series of spells that deal with fishing nets, the moon is referred to in connection with lunar festivals and again with its mansion. These spells, it must be emphasized, introduce a new theme because the fishing net and lunar motifs did not feature together in the pyramid text. The moon is also mentioned twice in spell 824 that was supposed to make the effective spirit of the deceased powerful. As for the lunar gods, Khonsu appears in about 15 spells. A recurring motif in spells 187 and 195 is that the deceased meets him on his way back from Punt, the mythical land that in funerary literature represents East, that is, the place of sunrise. Interestingly enough, both in spells 195 and 573, the Coffin text variant of the Cannibal Hymn, Khonsu features in a passage which also makes a reference to the time of lunar invisibility. This may offer further support for the identification of Khonsu with the sickle of the waning moon in the east, at least in the particular context of the pyramid and Coffin text. Spell 311 is concerned with becoming Khonsu himself, showing the increased importance of the god. The violent nature of Khonsu is still alluded to, since in spell 994 he is said to live on heads. Thoth is mentioned much more frequently than Khonsu in the Coffin text, and this is no doubt partly due to the relatively large portion of spells that were recorded in its chief cult center, Hermopolis, or its necropolis at the time, Deir el-Bershah. Again, Thoth may be included in the text because of his many roles in different mythological cycles. However, it is in the Coffin text that his identity with the moon is first expressly stated, because one variant of spell 1096, which was already mentioned above, identifies the god holding the Eye of Horus in the mansion of the moon as Moon Tahuti or Moon Thoth. It may be added that the role of Thoth in saving the lunar eye is also emphasized in a preceding spell. At the beginning of the New Kingdom, a new collection of spells known as the Book of Going Forth by Day supersedes the older corpus of the Coffin text. In it, the lunar themes that already appeared in the Pyramid and Coffin text continue to be perpetuated. The relative proportion of text mentioning lunar day feasts increases, as 17 of the 192 chapters include such references. On the one hand, they often emphasize the deceased's knowledge about these feasts, while on the other, the rubrics of some spells stipulate that the rituals described should be performed on specific days of the lunar month. Spells addressing the moon as the sole one made their way into the Book of Going Forth by Day, chapters 2 and 65, just as the moon keeps being mentioned in its role as the celestial ferryman and in connection with fishing, chapters 99 and 153. Chapter 99 also includes references to the Eye of Horus, falling on the eastern side of the sky. Thus, it is a direct descendant of Utterance 359 of the Pyramid text. While Khonsu only appears twice in the Book of Going Forth by Day, spells 83 and 153, Thoth is frequently mentioned. It is quite clear that, for example, in spell 80, he features in his lunar capacity because the deceased claims that he has equipped the god in the mansion of the moon. Spell 80 also talks about the filling of the eye in relation to the 6th or 15th day of the month, so it is clearly one of the truly lunar spells of the Book of Going Forth by Day. While the Book of Going Forth by Day continued to be used into Ptolemaic times from the late period onwards, yet another set of new compositions started to augment or replace it. Some of these picked upon a theme that had already been alluded to in the earlier mortuary spells and elaborated it further, so that in the end, whole new compositions were created. The moon frequently occurred in these new compositions too. For example, in one of the commonly used later texts, which was centered around the topic of breathing, the letter for breathing which Isis made for her brother Osiris, we read that Isis compiled the lines of this work inter alia to make that the Ba of Osiris may appear in the sky as the disk of the moon. In the second half of the 18th dynasty, the deification of Amenhotep III meant not only his identification with the solar god, but also with the moon, as his inscriptions in the Temple of Celeb in Nubia attest to it. Later, after the interlude of Akhenaten, the jewelry of Tutankhamun, recovered from his famous and almost intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings, includes some pieces that feature lunar motifs. For example, the elaborate pectoral showing a beautifully represented scarab as it lifts a bark with the left eye and lunar disc on board, the latter encompassing the figures of Thoth, the pharaoh himself, and Ra-Heruka-Huti. It was also in the reign of Tutankhamun that his general and later successor, Hor-Imheb, had a statue made with inscriptions including a hymn to the moon Thoth. In his famous decree aimed at restoring law and order after the Armada upheaval, Hor-Imheb declares that he will be reborn like the moon. In the edifice of Taharka, the chapel of the Baas of Amen and his union with Ra have an interior room, F, that is badly damaged, yet it contains important remnants of the text of the morning song. The hymn requests Amen to wake up, that he preside over his left eye, and that he is loved in his name of perfection of the moon god. The moon is a meta symbol for levels of phage production. The whole moon or mid-month festival representing active crow production. When the prophage excises, the concentration of crow protein is now at a point of binding to both OL and OR. The perfection of the moon god or Thoth is that transcription can now proceed for protein production related to head and tail assembly along with bacterial cell lysis. The damaged text then mentions Nefri, who knows what overflows the two lands, that is, recombinant phage progeny. Also mentioned is the ram, soul that is in the coils of the Mehenet serpent, shining because of its two brilliant eyes, the falcon of falcons, Heruka-Huti, the god of the recumbent ones. The god of the recumbent ones who enter the inundation as water, and the god of those who are in their mouths. Thus, the full function of the eye of Horus results in crow protein production related to the creation of the Horus species, excision of the prophage, and phage progeny release. Using a parallel text in the temple of Opet at Karnak, Goyon defines this scene as the procession of 10 Baas. Ba 1 is Amun or Amen, Khepri, Ra'atun, Ra, the unique one who created himself in the form of millions, which can now be understood as the self-creation or molecular formation of millions of phage progeny.